Okay, students, this is your favorite teacher, Mrs. Milligan, here to give you a little bit of an introduction to the Odyssey. So sit back, relax, let your eyeballs do all the work, and hopefully it seeps into your brain. All right, so before we begin, I just want to review with you, what is mythology? We went over this before break, but just to kind of recall, right? Myths. The actual word means stories, and ology, that word means study of. So if you put it together, what it is the study of stories. And specifically, these stories are from ancient cultures. And the reason why ancient cultures came up with these stories is to really explain the unexplainable. Things like, earthquakes, tornadoes, sudden death. They really didn't understand the world around them. So, in order to explain it, they went ahead and created a religion that they truly believed in. And it wasn't just ancient Greece, it was many different cultures throughout ancient societies. But we're going to focus on ancient Greece for the simple fact of, if you recall, that ancient Greece is really the roots of our Western civilization in America today. So we study the Odyssey so we can look at their culture, look at how people actually interact, how do they worship, what do they hold sacred and important. They definitely, ancient Greece is the root of many aspects of our language. But not only that, how do they use it to communicate with one another? What do they find formal, informal? And then what do they say? How does that reveal their priorities? And then finally, because we learn about their government, which really is the basis of our democracy, how did they structure their society? How do they solve their problems? And by looking at the Odyssey, we can really compare and contrast to how we run our society and really develop a deeper understanding of what we hold moral and true. So, in order to understand the story, again, I want to give you a little bit of background to the story. And we went over the topography, or basically the lay of the land of Greece. And even today, it is a mainland country, but it has many tiny island settlements. And these islands are very rocky and they have very, very little agriculture. But they are known for their olive trees, right? But beyond that, really, it was the sea that was their survival. The way that the country and the settlements on the islands are situated, right? Fishing was definitely very important, and then trading throughout the Mediterranean Sea. And just to give you a better idea, if you look at the map of the world, right, we're really kind of focusing on this area. And if you zoom in a little bit there, you'll see that Greece is perfectly situated between Asia, the Middle East, all of Africa, all of Europe, budding Europe at that time, and then beyond. And so they really were the center of trade and commerce and philosophy during ancient society. And just a little picture to remind you of what the topography of Greece looks like. It's very rocky again, right? You see no agriculture. Everything's very stone based. So now that we got a little bit of background on the Odyssey and Greece, a little review of what mythology is, we're going to look specifically at a certain type of story that you'll find throughout ancient societies. And many cultures have these stories, and that's an epic. And the most famous Greek author of epic poetry is Homer. Not Homer Simpson, but Homer. His name has even been changed into an adjective that means large scale, massive, or enormous, because he's credited with these titles. Now, you read a little bit of background on Homer, and you'll notice that they don't really know when he was born. They don't have any documents to really prove it. In Asia Minor, right, which is close to Greece, but not exactly there. It's really north of the Middle East, but it's debatable. Again, there's really no proof. But legend has it that he was blind and he was outcasted because of that, which means basically he was sent out of society, most likely due to leprosy or some disease at that time, which would make him travel a lot. And because he traveled, he became a little bit more sophisticated. He learned stories from all different cultures. And he's credited as the author, but obviously, right, if legend has it that he was blind, he most likely had a scribe that wrote everything for him. He's given credit for writing 2 epic poems, the first one being the Iliad and the second being the Odyssey. The Odyssey is the one that we will look at in detail. He's given the credit for creating basically the plot outline for any epic, and all of the requirements that go along with this type of narrative poetry. But before we can really understand what the Odyssey is all about, we really got to understand what the first poem was about, and that was the Iliad, and it was epic indeed. Okay, the reason why it's titled the Iliad is because it was about the main subject of the poem, Ilium, or better known as Troy. And Troy was an ancient city around the same time as ancient Greece that was known for their wealth, for their warfare, and for a city surrounded by a wall that was or walls that were impenetrable. Penetrable. Spelling? I don't know. But the entire story of the Iliad focuses on the Trojan War, a very famous war, a 10-year war between Troy and Greece, or what today is known as Turkey. This battle was between 2 sets of soldiers, the Trojans and the Spartans. So if you want to think of it as something you can apply to today, our colleges, USC versus MSU. Now, the background to this story is supposedly based on Helen, a wife of an ancient Greek warrior who was stolen by a prince of Troy. And the story goes that Menelaus, Helen's husband, wanted to go back and get her from Troy. And that's the legend, the myth. But in reality, most wars are started because of money. And as we talked about earlier, Troy was known for its wealth. Not only that, it had resources that the ancient Greeks didn't have living on their rocky territory. Things like woods full of, possible shipbuilding materials, in addition to cash and minerals and just land in general. And after that 10-year war, the Greeks won. So victory for MSU. But the reason why they won was because of a trick, something called the Trojan horse. And it was Odysseus that came up with this trick. That'll play out later on. In your iBook on page 1507, there's actually a history documentary called The Passion of Helen. And it talks about this myth of the Trojan War. So it's a little bit of enrichment if you're interested. So now that we understand the background to the Odyssey, and now that you know that Odysseus was part of the original epic poem, the Iliad, and the famed Trojan War, let's look at a little bit of background of him. So just like the Iliad is about Ilium or Troy, the Odyssey is about Odysseus. And Odysseus is an ancient Greek warrior, and he's the one that really stepped up to the plate during the Trojan War. Like most of the actual leaders of the Greek army, he was a king, and specifically of the settlement Ithaca, which is an island of Greece. And the Odyssey is about his 10-year adventure sailing home after the war. And the reason why it took 10 years is because Odysseus needed to learn some lessons here, right? He's a hero with an attitude. And the attitude can be debatable. as far as is it warranted or not. But regardless, he needed to learn a lesson on that 10-year journey home. So even though he was the hero of the Trojan War for coming up with the ruse of the Trojan horse, he really got a big head after that and really thought that he was all powerful, and even challenged the gods and their help for his trick. And because of this, he was sent on a 10-year journey home where he needed to learn the gods are all powerful. You never boast about your heroic deeds in a manner that would offend a god or a goddess, because if you know anything about mythology, right, they will equal or equalize the playing field if you are having any type of boastful issues. Another lesson and something you can take away from this story is that home is the ultimate goal. His persistence to get himself and his men home is clear throughout the story, and it repeats over and over. But because he is a hero, we learn about what is courage, what's loyalty, and what is honor to the ancient Greek people. And again, we compare and contrast what we believe to be heroic or not. So now that we have a little bit of background on the poem, we're going to learn about the epic. And specifically, because we're looking at this genre, it is a type of writing. Just like there's short stories, there's nonfiction, there's poetry. This epic is a long narrative poem, and it recounts the adventures of an epic hero. So it's your basic hero story. But what makes it epic, right? An epic hero is larger than life. He goes above and beyond, oftentimes insurmountable feats that most humans could ever endure. But he is helped by gods or goddesses, so keep that in mind, right? He gets divine help. And then there's the epic plot. It starts in medias res. And what does that mean? It means it starts in the middle of the actual story. And we'll look at this a little bit more detailed later on in the week. The epic setting is the known world at the time. So he basically is traveling throughout the Mediterranean, visiting many different lands while he's trying to get home. There's an epic simile. And basically, it's the same thing as a normal simile, right? It uses like or as. But sometimes you'll find comparisons made with so or as if. So pay attention to these key words. And then what makes it epic is it's super long. It's not just a simple simile. It's going to go on for several lines. Another characteristic of an epic poem are epithets. And we'll look at this in detail as we read. But epithets are known as appositives. Maybe you learned those phrases somewhere along in your career. But they're basically titles or phrases that give more information about the character, who's their parents, where did they come from. But again, I'll give you examples of these as we go along through the introduction of the actual epic. And then there's allusions. And we learned this term with the poetry unit, but just to help recall, allusions are going to be references to known people, places, or things. And so we'll look at those too as we go through the active reading. And then archetypes. Okay, archetypes, basically symbols that you'll find throughout any piece of literature, no matter what time period or what culture it comes from. And specifically, right, we're going to be looking at the hero. And this epic hero, right, keep in mind, he completes insurmountable feats. And he gets divine help. This here is just a little map of the Odyssey. Here is where the Iliad took place in Ilium. and this is where the Trojan War raged for 10 years. And here's Odysseus's home. So he had to sail all the way over here to fight for 10 years. And then he had to sail all the way back home. But it's just not that easy. He has a lot of issues because if you look at the topography once again, right, you've got all these islands. You've got an interesting obstacle course here, especially if you add in divine influence like Zeus controlling the weather, or Poseidon controlling the sea, or monsters popping out of rocks, or one-eyed cannibals wanting to eat you. So keep in mind that this adventure, this 10-year adventure, is going to surprise you with some interesting conflicts. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the introduction to the Odyssey.